I'm Peter Henderson, and this is the Case Against Celtic Boys Club podcast.
The founder of Celtic Boys Club has been found guilty of sexual offences against 3 boys in the 1980s and 1990s.
What the case comes down to is whether or not Celtic Football Club are responsible in law for the terrible acts of the paedophiles at the heart of Celtic Boys Club.
One by one, he raped them. He raped them systematically.
A child has got no chance of getting away from the child abuser. The fear and the terror is off the scale.
We're all young boys, 14, 15, so nobody was going to really say anything because would they have been believed?
Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Case Against Celtic Boys Club podcast. In this episode we're going to hear from Tom. That's not his real name, but as we've said before, the protection of victims' identities is of the utmost importance. Tom is a survivor of one of the most determined, intelligent and wicked child abusers in the Celtic Boys Club paedophile network, Kenneth Divers. A now convicted paedophile serving a prison sentence, Divers was a wood and metalwork teacher at a high school in Paisley, a very large town next to Glasgow. He was also a scout for Celtic Football Club, singled out for praise in the club's official newspaper, the Celtic View. Divers was extremely active in his local youth football scene, where he would brag to young players and their parents about his close connections with Celtic and Celtic Boys Club. We'll explore just how close he was to the Boys Club paedophile ring in later episodes. But in this episode, Tom will share with us how the vile Divers groomed both him and his parents to carry out a series of shocking sexual assaults against him and other children.
This podcast will not be gratuitous, but it will discuss the sexual abuse of children and its consequences. The biggest thing you can do to support the podcast is to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. The more members of the public that know about this podcast means the more people getting the survivor's message out there. The podcast is free, but it does take a lot of time and effort to make. If you're able to make a small donation to its production, it goes a long way to help. Please follow the link to our Patreon donation site. It's your help that makes this podcast possible.
Tom began by telling me what it was like growing up in Paisley, about his love of football and the rivalry between Scotland's 2 largest football clubs, Rangers and Celtic. This is the first time he has ever spoken publicly.
Even when I was young, I can remember the kind of rivalry between Celtic and Rangers. But I was quite lucky. My uncle, who stayed downstairs from us, was a Rangers fan. When I was very young, he used to take me to Rangers games. But I was a St Mirren supporter, and I would go to Love Street every chance I had. So I would grow up watching my St Mirren team, but also lucky enough to go to Ibrox to watch Wally Henderson, Jim Baxter, guys like that. But the other side, my best friend, he was a Celtic fan, and we used to go to watch Celtic as well. So I grew up with these guys, Bobby Lennox, Jimmy Johnson, so I call it my football education. I wanted to be like these guys.
You're a kid that was obsessed with football, you love football. When did you first encounter this man, Kenneth Divers, who would play such a significant role in your life?
When I left primary school, I went to St Ailridge Secondary in Paisley, and he was a technical teacher. He used to teach us woodwork, metalwork, technical drawing. He was a young teacher. It was an all-boys school, and he used to encourage us to call him Kenny or KD, which a lot of the guys liked instead of the surf stuff and all that, because, you know, back in the day there was teachers who were quite heavy-handed, but it was quite refreshing to meet a teacher who just seemed like one of the guys.
And so how did Kenneth Divers and football connect with you as part of your life?
Well, along with one of the PE teachers, he would take the trials for the football team, and then he would take the football team on a Saturday or after school when we were playing. So he was there as basically the coach.
And what sort of coach was he? How did he do with the kids?
Yeah, he was good. He used to explain a lot of things, and he did. We did actually quite well. In first year we got the final of the Summer Cup, and we got again third year in the Summer Cup. So as far as coaching was concerned, he knew what he was talking about. And then there was sometimes if we didn't have a game, he would take myself and my best friend at that time to some games at Parkhead, and he would explain positional play and all that, which was great at the time.
Why do you think he was taking you to Parkhead? Did you know at this stage that he had a connection with Celtic or the Celtic family of clubs? I knew he was a Celtic supporter, and I knew that he had connections at Celtic because he talked about it all the time. He would show everybody his ID card signed by Jock Stein as his scout ID. He used to show everybody that. Was he telling you and like the other kids and everyone that he had these connections with Celtic? Oh, he would basically brag about it. Oh, he would say if you work hard, then he'll get us into Celtic Boys Club or get Celtic to look at us, have a look at us, which he did, where two of my teammates actually went to Celtic Boys Club. See, when you're a kid and someone says to you, your teacher and your coach is saying to you, I've got connections at Celtic Boys Club, what does that mean to kids? Oh, for somebody that wants to be a footballer, it means everything to them because it's a chance, and there's a lot of kids go through the system, as I know in my experience in football. But if anybody says that to you, you're going to get excited and you're going to work hard and do all you can to get that chance. So your impression and the other kids' impression was this was a guy who was connected with Celtic? Yes, definitely. So when did Divers' behaviour towards you change? At what point did you realise things aren't right here? He invited three of the boys down to his house in Dunoon. He actually came from Dunoon, a village called Sandbank, where his mum stayed, and he had digs in Paisley, because he worked in Paisley obviously. But just to get away for the weekend was exciting. You thought, I'm going away for a few days, and somewhere I'd never been, and my mum and dad naturally thought this was very kind of him, and I suppose the other guys as well didn't think anything of it. So off we went down to Downham for the weekend. What happened in Downham? He lived in a kind of terraced bungalow, that's the only way I can describe it, with his mum. There was 2 bedrooms in the house. His mum slept in one, the living room, kitchen, bathroom, and in the living room there was a bed settee. So because there was 3 of us staying, the arrangements was that one of us would sleep with Divers and the other 2 would sleep in the bed settee, and then the next night one of us would change over. So unfortunately the first night was my turn to sleep with Divers in his bedroom. You had to share a bed with Divers. What happened? After we were... Well, first of all, I'd like to note that in the living room and in his bedroom there was adult magazines lying about, which we as young guys looked at and giggled, but didn't think anything of it, because it didn't happen in my house. But there was these magazines lying in the living room along with a pile of National Geographic magazines, and in his bedside table there was another couple of adult magazines. So I went into bed, I had my pyjamas on. I was quite embarrassed as Divers got into bed naked. He then started a conversation about, do I have a girlfriend?
which I replied, at that age, would you call a girlfriend, you know? Yeah, I'm going with this girl, yes. And then he asked me, do you touch her or does she touch you? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, what do you do with her? And I said, we just kiss, you know, at parties or whatever. And he said, well, do you know what touching can lead to? And I said, no. He says, well, it can lead to sex, and if you have sex and she gets pregnant, your life will be ruined, her life will be ruined, your parents will be really, really upset, their life will be ruined, it'll be so embarrassing for you.
Tom now goes on to describe a sickening and serious sexual assault by Divers on him, which we cannot include in the podcast.
There was another incident of abuse at Hampden Park, which...
What's park?
Hampden Park.
At Hampden Park?
Yeah.
Which is the National Football Stadium for Scotland.
There was no seating at the time. He took me to watch Scotland against England. I always remember it because it was the game, nothing each, and it was the game. There's a fantastic photograph of Colin Stein being fouled by Brian Labone in the box, and Scotland never getting a penalty. I think it was around 69. And because there was no seats, there was standing only, and you can imagine a Scotland-England game. I was pressed up against a barrier, and all through the game I could feel him pressing himself up against me with, obviously, aroused an erection. And he was behind me, he was at the side of me, and I couldn't go anywhere because there was people crammed up against us, and in front of me was a barrier. And at this time he had organised a trip to Spain for four pupils, which he had bought a car and he was going to drive to Spain. And all through this game I thought to myself, I don't want to go to Spain. I don't know what's going to happen in this holiday in Spain. And we left early, and as we were walking down Cathcart Road to go to the train station, I saw a car coming round the corner, and the only thought that was in my head was, I'm not going to Spain. And I stepped out in front of that car.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back soon. Welcome back. Remember, to help this podcast, you can subscribe, leave us a review, follow us on Twitter, and follow us on our new YouTube channel. Now, let's get back to Tom's story.
And that, I think, was my first attempt at my life.
What happened when the car hit you?
The car hit me. I went over the top of the car, kind of hooked onto the bumper, and was dragged down Cathcart Road. And I remember sitting up and seeing Divers running down the road towards me. Well, I'd broken my femur, and I was taken to Victoria Hospital. I was lying in the recovery room, or the room getting before triage kind of thing, and this guy came up to me and rubbed my head and said, what have you been doing to yourself? And it was Jeff Hurst and Bobby Monker, who had been taken off with head knocks. So even in my kind of darkest time, I met a World Cup hat-trick scorer. I remember it vividly.
So you were lying in the hospital?
Yeah.
Because of your injuries from trying to get away from Divers?
I did.
And you had an England World Cup star come up?
Yeah, asked me if I was alright, you know, that kind of thing. So that meant a broken femur. I was in plaster for a year, and a walking stick for 6 months. That, obviously, that's the way they dealt with a broken femur. It's quite a serious injury. But it got me out the Spain trip. And during that time, he'd been bringing homework down to the house because I wasn't at school. And he kept up with my homework and all that. And again, everybody thought this was amazing.
Can you talk about how you felt about you couldn't confide in your parents and the fact that this evil man had his tentacles into your family?
It's worse than that, Peter. he did such a good job that my parents invited him in to stay in our house when they didn't have digs in Paisley. So that made it worse for me, because he abused me in my home one night when my mum and dad were lying in the next room. He lost his digs in Paisley, and my mum and dad thought it was unreasonable to ask this guy to come from Dunoon every day to go to school. So they invited him to stay in the living room, sleep on the settee until he got a new house. I used to share a bedroom with my young sister. There was 2 single beds in the front bedroom, and nothing happened up to this night. My sister had a sleepover at my aunt's across the road, and my parents quite innocently said, "Kenny, instead of sleeping on the couch tonight, why don't you sleep in his bed?" And he's like, "Oh, that's great." And after about half an hour, he came over to my bed, and I was like a board. I was lying there shaking, and he lay on top of me. He tried to kiss me in the mouth.
We've had to remove this section of Tom's testimony as it describes an awful sexual assault perpetrated by Divers.
I was crying, and I nearly screamed, but I didn't, because I knew my mum and dad. I knew it would do it, my mum and dad. So he got up and went back into bed. But I remember, it scares me now, thinking what would have happened if my mum and dad had walked into that room. My dad would have killed him. My dad would have got into trouble for that man. But I couldn't tell my mum and dad it didn't happen, because they invited him into their house. So I didn't want them thinking they invited him in to abuse me. And until 30 years later, I told my mum, and my dad never knew. She just wanted to know what was wrong. Mum's no. And I had to sit my mum and my sister down and tell them. It broke her heart.
You can stop now, mate, okay? We have to leave Tom's account for now, but in the next episode he'll tell us just how close Kenneth Divers was to the leaders of the Celtic Boys Club paedophile ring, Jim Torbett and Frank Kearney, and how he began his long quest to bring the evil Divers to justice. We know that the podcast deals with extremely serious issues that are sometimes hard to listen to, but the biggest thing that you can do to show your support is to follow and subscribe. You can also follow us on Twitter, subscribe to the Case Against Celtic Boys Club YouTube channel, and if possible, make a small donation via our Patreon site. The more followers the podcast receives, the more widely we can take the story of what is the biggest child abuse scandal in British sport. Thanks again for your time, and we'll be back soon with episode 7.